I didn't decide to stay quiet because I was brave. I stayed quiet because something about the moment told me that noise would make things worse. At the time, I was 42, living alone in a small duplex on a street that went completely still after midnight. I'd been there long enough to feel comfortable, long enough to know the rhythm of the place, which houses turned off their lights first, which cars belonged to which neighbors, which sounds were normal, and which ones weren't. That night, I was awake later than usual. I'd fallen into one of those stretches where sleep felt optional, like my body had decided it didn't need rest anymore. I sat on the couch with a blanket over my legs, the TV muted but still on, mostly for the light. I didn't want the house completely dark, but I didn't want it bright either. Somewhere in between felt safer. Just after midnight, I heard a sound outside that made me freeze. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden. It was the kind of sound that slips into your awareness quietly and makes you question whether you really heard it at all. I muted the TV completely and listened. Nothing followed. I told myself it was probably a car passing, or someone closing a door down the street. I'd heard worse noises before and ignored them. Still, I didn't turn the TV back on. I stayed still, listening harder than I meant to. A minute passed. Then another. That was when I heard it again. A soft sound near the front of the house, like someone shifting their weight on the concrete walkway. My heart started beating faster. Not in panic, but in alertness. I leaned forward slightly, careful not to move too much. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, making me flinch. Unknown number. I frowned and picked it up, irritated more than scared. When I opened the message, my stomach tightened. "You're still up." I stared at the words, rereading them, trying to understand how they could mean anything. I hadn't told anyone I was awake. I hadn't posted anything. I typed back, asking who it was, then deleted the message before sending it. Something told me responding was a mistake. The phone buzzed again. I can hear the TV. My chest tightened. The TV was muted, but it was still on. I glanced toward the screen instinctively, then looked away. I didn't want to confirm anything. I turned the TV off completely. The house went quiet, too quiet. I sat there, phone in my hand, listening to my own breathing. I told myself this had to be a coincidence, someone guessing, someone trying to scare a random number, but the timing felt too precise. Another message appeared. "That's better." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. I didn't reply. I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was, the way you do when you're not sure if movement will make you more visible. Outside, I heard another sound. Slow footsteps this time, measured and careful, moving closer to the front of the house. I slid my phone into my hand and held it tightly, my thumb hovering over the call button. I didn't press it yet. I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want whoever was outside to hear me talking. The phone buzzed again. "You don't have to say anything." That sentence scared me more than the others. It suggested awareness, like they were reacting to what I was choosing not to do. I moved slowly down the hallway toward the bedroom, careful to place my feet softly. I closed the bedroom door and locked it, something I almost never did. I sat on the bed and listened. The footsteps outside stopped. Then, a soft sound near the door. Not knocking, just a faint scrape, like someone adjusting their stance. My phone buzzed again. "I like when you stay quiet." My hands started shaking. I pressed my palm against my mouth to keep from breathing too loudly. I dialed emergency services, but didn't hit call yet. I didn't know how to explain what was happening without sounding ridiculous. All I had were messages. No threats. No demands. Just observations. Outside, the sound moved again, closer now. I could hear someone standing just beyond the door, not touching it, not testing the handle, just being there, waiting. The phone buzzed. "You're good at this." That was when I pressed call. I whispered my address to the operator when she answered, telling her someone was outside my house and messaging me. She asked if I could see them. I said no. She asked if I could hear anything. I told her yes, but quietly. She told me officers were on the way and to stay where I was. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening to the person outside. They didn't knock. They didn't try the door. They stayed silent, like they were listening to me the same way I was listening to them. My phone buzzed one last time. "I won't stay long." I don't know how much time passed before I heard sirens. At first, they were distant, then closer. Outside, the footsteps moved quickly, no longer careful. I heard someone retreat down the walkway and disappear into the night. When the police arrived, the front of the house was empty, no one nearby, no signs of forced entry. They asked if I recognized the number. I didn't. One officer told me it was a good thing I'd stayed quiet. Later, sitting alone again with every light on, I realized something unsettling. Staying quiet hadn't made me invisible. It had told someone exactly how much control they had over the moment. And that was only the beginning. I stayed on the bed long after the operator told me officers were on the way, my phone still pressed to my ear even when there was nothing left to say. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I focused on staying quiet, the way I already had been, because somehow it felt like sound was the one thing I still had control over. The house felt smaller than it ever had before, like the walls were leaning in to listen. When the sirens finally reached the street, I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time since the messages began. Outside, I heard movement again, faster this time, careless in a way it hadn't been before. Footsteps moved away from the door, down the walkway, and then nothing, just the low hum of distant traffic and the approaching sirens. The police knocked a few minutes later. I didn't answer right away. I waited until I heard one of them say my name, calm and clear, before unlocking the bedroom door and stepping into the hallway. I turned lights on as I went, needing the house to look normal again. They checked the front door, the windows, the side of the house. Nothing was broken. Nothing forced. One of them asked if I'd seen anyone. I said no. I hadn't wanted to look. They took my phone and scrolled through the messages. One officer's face tightened slightly, just for a moment, before he smoothed it out again. He asked if I recognized the number. I didn't. He asked if anyone knew I was alone that night. I said not specifically. He nodded, like that wasn't unusual. Before they left, one of the officers said something quietly, almost like an aside. He said sometimes people pay attention to reactions more than actions. That staying quiet can tell someone just as much as shouting. I didn't know what to say to that. After they were gone, the house felt hollow. I turned every light on and sat on the couch until morning, replaying everything in my head. The sounds, the timing, the way the messages responded to what I did and didn't do. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, the street looked ordinary again. Neighbors came and went. A delivery truck stopped down the block. Sunlight filled the living room like nothing had happened. I almost convinced myself it had all been exaggerated by exhaustion. Almost. I took the day off work and stayed home. I walked the house slowly, checking every window and door, noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The way sound carried in the hallway. The way the front door sat just close enough to the street that someone could stand there without being seen from inside. I realized how predictable my nights must have looked from the outside. That evening, I tried to change things. I turned lights on earlier. I left the TV playing at a normal volume. I moved around more than usual, deliberately making noise, as if unpredictability itself could protect me. I checked the locks twice, 3 times. For a while, nothing happened. No messages, no sounds. By 11, I started to relax. I told myself that once police were involved, whoever it was would move on, that the attention would shift elsewhere. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. You didn't stay quiet tonight. My chest tightened instantly. I stared at the screen, my hands cold. I typed back, telling them to stop contacting me. The reply came after a pause. I noticed. I locked my bedroom door and sat on the bed, phone in my hand, breathing slowly. I told myself not to engage. That reacting would only encourage more. Minutes passed. Then another message appeared. You're louder when you're scared. That was when I realized something had changed. The first night, staying quiet had been the right choice. Or at least it had felt that way. Now, it felt like whatever I did would be noticed, interpreted, used. Outside, I heard movement again. Not footsteps this time, just the faint sound of someone standing near the front of the house, shifting their weight. My phone buzzed. I'm not staying. I didn't call the police immediately. I waited, listening. The sound outside lingered for a moment, then faded. No knock, no test of the door, just absence again. Nothing else happened that night. Over the next week, I changed everything. I altered my schedule. I came home at different times. I slept with lights on. I changed my phone number. I installed cameras, even though part of me hated the idea of watching my own house all the time. I wanted layers between me and the quiet. For a while, it worked. No messages, no sounds. The fear dulled into something manageable. I started sleeping again. Then, nearly a month later, my phone buzzed while I was at work. Unknown number. You're not alone at night anymore. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it and blocking the number. Nothing else followed. No escalation, no explanation. I moved not long after. New place, busier street, more light, more noise. I didn't tell many people where I was going. Even now, years later, I think about that night, about how instinctively I chose silence, and how that choice became part of the interaction. What stays with me isn't just the fear of being watched. It's the understanding that someone noticed the moment I decided to stay quiet, and that noticing was enough to change everything. I didn't think being awake late was something anyone else would notice. It felt personal, almost invisible, like one of those habits you slip into without meaning to. At the time, I was 40, living alone in a narrow townhouse where the walls felt close, and the street out front stayed quiet after midnight. I worked odd hours, and my sleep schedule followed that, so being up late wasn't unusual for me. What I didn't realize was how predictable that made my nights. That evening started like many others. I came home a little after 9, reheated dinner, and left the TV on low while I scrolled through my phone. I kept only one lamp on in the living room. I liked the rest of the house dark. It made the space feel contained, manageable. Around 10:30, I muted the TV and focused on reading. I remember thinking how calm everything felt, how rare it was to have a night with nothing demanding my attention. Just before 11, I stood up to make tea. As I walked through the kitchen, I noticed how still the house felt. Not silent exactly, just settled. I poured hot water into a mug and leaned against the counter, listening. Nothing seemed wrong. That was when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I frowned, annoyed more than anything. When I opened the message, my stomach tightened a little. It said, "You're still awake." I stared at the screen, rereading it. I hadn't told anyone I was up. I hadn't posted anything. I told myself it was probably a wrong number and set the phone down without replying. I took my mug back to the living room and sat down, trying to forget about it. The phone buzzed again. "You always are." My chest felt tight. I picked the phone up and typed back that they had the wrong person. The reply came quickly. "No, I don't." I locked the phone and sat there, listening. The house felt different now, like the quiet had sharpened. I glanced toward the front window, then looked away. I didn't want to confirm anything. I took a sip of tea, my hand shaking just enough that I noticed. Another message appeared. "You turn the TV off when it's this late." I felt a chill move through me. The TV was muted, the screen dark. I hadn't said anything out loud. I hadn't moved loudly enough for someone outside to hear me. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. People guess things. People get lucky. I stood up and checked the front door lock, even though I remembered locking it earlier. It was secure. I checked the back door. Locked. Everything looked normal. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. The phone buzzed again. "You don't like noise at night." I went into the bedroom and closed the door quietly, locking it behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in my hand, trying to slow my breathing. I typed that they needed to stop contacting me. "I'm not bothering you," the reply said. "I'm just paying attention." That word stuck with me. Paying attention. It felt deliberate, like they were correcting a misunderstanding I hadn't voiced. I turned the bedroom light off, leaving only the faint glow from the hallway creeping under the door. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I wanted to feel less visible. Maybe I didn't want whoever it was to imagine me clearly. My phone buzzed. "You sleep better when it's dark." I whispered "no" under my breath and pressed my back against the headboard. I dialed emergency services, but didn't press call yet. I didn't know how to explain what was happening without sounding dramatic. All I had were messages. No threats, no demands. Just observations that felt too accurate. Outside, I heard something near the front of the house. Not loud, just a faint sound, like someone shifting their weight on the walkway. I froze, barely breathing. The phone buzzed again. "I'm not inside." That sentence made my stomach drop. It didn't comfort me. It clarified something I hadn't asked about. I pressed call and whispered my address to the operator when she answered, telling her someone was messaging me and I thought they might be outside. She asked if I could see anyone. I said no. She asked if I heard anything. I told her I wasn't sure. While I was on the call, the sound came again. Soft footsteps, slow and careful, moving along the front of the house. They stopped near the door. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears filling them, whispering everything to the operator. She told me officers were on the way and to stay where I was. The footsteps didn't come closer. They didn't knock. They just stayed there, like whoever it was listening. My phone buzzed one more time. "You should be asleep by now." I stayed on the bed, shaking, until I heard sirens in the distance. The footsteps moved away quickly after that, fading into the quiet. By the time the police arrived, the front of the house was empty. They searched the area, but didn't find anyone. One of the officers asked if I recognized the number. I didn't. Another told me it was good that I'd called. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay there with every light on, replaying the messages in my head. What unsettled me most wasn't just that someone knew I was awake. It was realizing how easy it had been for them to notice when I was alone late at night. I stayed in the bedroom long after the officers left, sitting upright against the headboard with every light on, my phone resting face down on my chest like it might vibrate again if I wasn't careful. The house felt altered, not damaged, just exposed in a way I hadn't noticed before. Every sound seemed amplified. Every pause between sounds felt intentional. I replayed the messages in my head, not the words themselves, but the timing, how each one had arrived only after I did something or chose not to do something. It wasn't random, and that realization sat heavier than fear. When morning finally came, the townhouse looked exactly the same as it always had. Sunlight filled the living room, neighbors left for work, a dog barked somewhere down the block. In daylight, it was tempting to minimize what had happened, to tell myself I'd been tired or anxious or too ready to connect dots that weren't really there. I almost believed that until I checked my phone and saw the blocked numbers list longer than it had ever been before. I took the day off work and stayed home, moving through the house slowly, noticing things I had never paid attention to before, like how clearly the front window framed the couch, how easy it would be for someone outside to tell whether the TV was on or off, how the rhythm of my nights probably looked from the street. That thought stayed with me as the day went on. It wasn't just that someone had noticed me awake late, it was that my routine had been readable. That evening, I tried to disrupt everything. I turned on more lights than usual and left them on earlier. I kept the TV playing instead of muting it. I moved from room to room deliberately, making noise on purpose, telling myself unpredictability would make me harder to watch. For a while, it worked. No messages came, no sounds outside. By 11, my shoulders finally relaxed, and I started to feel foolish for how tightly wound I'd been. I told myself that whoever it was had probably moved on after realizing police had been involved. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "You're louder tonight." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my hands cold, the house suddenly feeling very quiet despite the noise I'd created. I didn't reply. I set the phone down and waited, telling myself that responding would only encourage more. A few minutes passed. Another message appeared. "It doesn't suit you." That was when I understood that changing my behavior hadn't made me invisible. It had made me noticeable in a different way. I locked the bedroom door and sat on the bed, breathing slowly, listening for sounds outside. I heard a car pass, then another. Nothing stopped. Nothing lingered. My phone buzzed again. "You'll go back to normal." That sentence felt less like a guess and more like a conclusion. I called emergency services again, explaining that the messages had resumed from another number and that whoever it was seemed to know my routine. The operator stayed calm and told me officers were on the way. While I waited, I heard movement near the front of the house. Not footsteps this time, just the faint sound of someone standing still, close enough to listen. My phone buzzed. "I can wait." I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, focusing on breathing quietly while the operator stayed on the line. The sound outside didn't move closer. It didn't move away either. It lingered, like whoever it was deciding how long to stay. When sirens finally cut through the quiet, the presence outside disappeared quickly, retreating without urgency but without hesitation. By the time the police arrived, there was no one there. They searched the street and the surrounding blocks and found nothing. One of the officers told me that sometimes people who watch routines get more interested when those routines change suddenly because change signals awareness. That explanation made an uncomfortable kind of sense. Over the next few days, I changed everything I could. I altered my work schedule, came home at different times, stopped using the living room late at night, and slept with lights on. I changed my phone number and didn't give it out easily. I installed cameras, even though I hated the feeling of monitoring my own space. Slowly, the messages stopped. The sounds outside didn't return. The fear dulled into something manageable, something I could live with. Months later, I was getting ready for bed earlier than usual when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. You're sleeping earlier now. I didn't reply. I blocked the number immediately. Nothing else came after that. I moved not long after, choosing a place with more foot traffic and less quiet. Even now, I still notice the time when the house settles into that late-night stillness. I still feel a flicker of unease when I realize I'm the only one awake. Because the most unsettling part wasn't being contacted or even being watched. It was realizing how easily someone could learn who you are simply by paying attention to when you're alone late at night. I didn't notice the silence right away. That was the strange part. It crept in slowly, the way it always did after midnight, when the neighborhood settled into something quieter than sleep. I was 39 at the time, living alone in a small, single-story house at the edge of a residential area where the streetlights were spaced too far apart and the nights felt longer than they should. I'd lived there for almost 3 years and thought I understood the rhythm of the place. When cars usually passed, when neighbors turned off their lights, when it was safe to stop paying attention. That night taught me how wrong that assumption was. I'd stayed up late, finishing some work on my laptop at the kitchen table. Nothing urgent, just things I'd put off during the day. I kept one light on above the sink and left the rest of the house dark. I liked knowing exactly where the light was and where it wasn't. Around 12:30 a.m., I closed the laptop and stretched, feeling that heavy tiredness that comes from being awake too long without realizing it. I stood up to pour myself a glass of water, and that was when I realized how quiet everything felt. No distant cars, no dogs barking, not even the hum I usually noticed from somewhere down the street. I paused with the glass in my hand and listened. Nothing. The house felt sealed off from the rest of the world, like it existed on its own for that moment. I told myself that was normal. Late nights were like that. I finished my water and walked into the living room, planning to turn off the last light and head to bed. As I reached for the lamp, something outside caught my attention. Not movement exactly, just a sense that something didn't belong. I looked toward the front window. The curtains were open a few inches, just enough to let in a slice of darkness. Across the street, I saw a shape that hadn't been there earlier. A car, parked slightly farther down than the usual overnight spots. The lights were off. The engine wasn't running. It wasn't doing anything noticeable at all. I stood there longer than I meant to, trying to remember if the car had been there when I got home. I couldn't picture it clearly. That alone made my chest tighten. I told myself it was probably a neighbor's guest, someone who didn't want to block a driveway. I reached over and turned the lamp off anyway. The living room dropped into shadow, lit only faintly by moonlight through the window. I took a step back toward the hallway when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I frowned, annoyed more than concerned, and unlocked the screen. The message was short. "You're still awake." My stomach tightened. I stared at the words, reading them again and again. I hadn't told anyone I was up. I hadn't posted anything. I typed a response asking who it was, then deleted it before sending. Something about the timing felt off. The phone buzzed again. I saw the light. I felt a chill run through me. I looked back toward the window instinctively, then forced myself to stop. I didn't want to confirm anything. I walked down the hallway and locked my bedroom door, something I rarely did. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in my hand, listening to the house. Another message came through. "You don't usually turn it off that fast." My heart started beating harder. I hadn't said anything out loud. I hadn't made noise. The idea that someone could see that small change made the room feel smaller. I typed back that they had the wrong number. The reply came quickly. "No, I don't." I pressed my back against the headboard and tried to slow my breathing. I told myself not to panic. Messages were just messages. There was no proof anyone was outside. Still, I listened harder, straining to hear something, anything, that might explain it all. Outside, I heard a sound. Not loud, just a soft shift, like someone adjusting their footing on pavement. My phone buzzed again. "You don't need to look." That sentence froze me. It felt like a response to a thought I hadn't acted on yet. I dialed emergency services, but hesitated before pressing call. I didn't know how to explain this without sounding ridiculous. Someone texting me wasn't a crime. A parked car wasn't illegal. The sound outside came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving along the front of the house. They stopped somewhere near the window. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands shaking as I finally pressed call. I whispered my address to the operator, telling her someone was outside and messaging me. She asked if I could see them. I said no. She asked if I could hear anything. I said yes, barely. While I stayed on the line, my phone buzzed again. I won't knock. I felt tears well up. Not from panic exactly, but from the tension of holding everything in. The footsteps stayed where they were, not moving closer, not leaving. Whoever it was seemed content, just standing there, listening, waiting. The operator told me officers were on the way and to stay inside. I stayed as still as I could, afraid that any movement would somehow matter. My phone buzzed one last time. You're good at staying quiet. A few minutes later, sirens broke the silence. The footsteps outside moved quickly then, no longer careful. I heard them retreat, followed by the sound of a car engine starting and pulling away. When the police arrived, the street was empty. They searched the area and found nothing. One of the officers asked if I recognized the number. I didn't. Another told me it was good, I hadn't gone outside. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in bed with every light on, replaying the messages over and over. What unsettled me most wasn't the car or the footsteps. It was realizing how closely someone had been watching my quiet, ordinary nights without me ever noticing. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten, sitting upright in bed with every lamp in the house turned on, listening to the ordinary sounds return, one by one as morning crept in. The officers had left after checking the street and nearby blocks, telling me to call again if anything else happened, but there was nothing else to point to, nothing tangible they could act on. When daylight finally arrived, the street looked completely normal. No car parked where I'd seen it, no footprints, no signs that anyone had stood outside my house for as long as it had felt like they did. In the calm of morning, I almost convinced myself the night had been exaggerated by exhaustion, that my mind had filled in gaps that weren't really there. Almost. I took the day off work and stayed home, moving slowly from room to room, replaying everything in my head. I stood at the front window more than once, checking the street even though I told myself not to. I realized how exposed the living room was, how clearly the light from that one lamp would have shone through the curtains, how easily someone could have noticed when it went off. That thought stayed with me all day. That evening, I tried to do things differently. I closed all the curtains before it got dark. I turned on more lights than usual and left the TV playing at a normal volume instead of muting it. I parked my car farther down the street instead of in front of the house, hoping that small changes might make me less predictable. For a while, it worked. No messages, no sounds. By 10:30, I felt my shoulders finally relax, and I started to feel foolish for how tense I'd been. I told myself that whoever it was had probably moved on after realizing police had been involved. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. You closed the curtains early. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my hands cold, the house suddenly feeling very quiet despite the noise I'd created. I didn't reply. I told myself that responding would only make things worse. A few minutes passed, then another message appeared. You're trying to hide. That was when I understood that changing my routine hadn't made me invisible. It had made me noticeable in a different way. I locked the bedroom door and sat on the bed, breathing slowly, listening for sounds outside. I heard a car pass, then another, but nothing stopped. My phone buzzed again. You'll look eventually. That sentence scared me more than anything else. It suggested patience, not urgency, like whoever it was had already decided how this would play out. I called emergency services again, explaining that the messages had resumed from another number and that the person seemed to know my routine. The operator stayed calm and told me officers were on the way. While I waited, I heard movement outside. Not footsteps at first, just the faint sound of someone standing still, close enough to listen. My phone buzzed. I can wait. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, focusing on breathing quietly while the operator stayed on the line. The sound outside didn't move closer. It didn't move away either. It lingered, like whoever it was deciding how long to stay. When sirens finally cut through the quiet, the presence outside disappeared quickly, retreating without urgency but without hesitation. By the time the police arrived, there was no one there. They searched the street and surrounding blocks again and found nothing. One officer told me that sometimes people who watch routines become more interested when those routines change suddenly because change signals awareness. That explanation made an uncomfortable kind of sense. Over the next few weeks, I changed everything I could. I altered my schedule, came home at different times, stopped using the living room late at night, and slept with lights on. I changed my phone number and didn't give it out easily. I installed cameras, even though I hated the feeling of monitoring my own space. Slowly, the messages stopped. The sounds outside didn't return. The fear dulled into something manageable, something I could live with. Months later, on a quiet evening when I was getting ready for bed earlier than usual, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "You don't stay up anymore." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking, then blocked the number without replying. Nothing else followed. I moved not long after, choosing a place with more foot traffic and less silence. Even now, I still notice parked cars that stay too long and feel a flicker of unease when the house settles into that late-night stillness. Because the most unsettling part wasn't the messages or the car or even the footsteps. It was realizing how much someone could learn about you simply by watching when you thought you were alone, and how choosing not to look back didn't mean you weren't still being seen.